Welcome to Monk's Temple. Close your eyes for just a moment. Not because I'm going to ask you to do anything complicated, but because I want you to notice something. Notice the weight of your body wherever you're sitting or lying right now. Notice the rise and fall of your breath, completely automatic, happening without any effort on your part. Notice the space between thoughts, that tiny gap where there's just awareness, nothing else. Now notice something else. Notice that somewhere beneath the surface of your ordinary awareness, there's a quiet hum of unease. A subtle tension. A feeling that something isn't quite right, that you should be doing something else, that you're running behind, that you're not enough, that time is slipping away. That feeling has a name. In the Buddhist tradition, it's called dukkha. Often translated as suffering, but that's too strong. It's more like dissatisfaction, unease, the sense that things are never quite perfect, never quite complete, never quite enough. And here's what's remarkable about this feeling: most of us spend our entire lives trying to escape it. We run from this unease into our phones, our work, our relationships, our entertainment, our food, our fantasies about the future, our regrets about the past. We run so constantly and so automatically that after a while, we forget we're running at all. We just think this is what life is, a constant forward motion away from something we never stop to examine. But somewhere in the forests of northeast Thailand, about 130 years ago, a small group of monks decided to stop running. Not just stop running in the way you might stop running on a treadmill. They stopped running from everything. From discomfort, from fear, from uncertainty, from the one thing every human being is most terrified of. They stopped running from death itself. And what they discovered in that stopping would challenge everything the Buddhist establishment of their time believed about practice. It would eventually spread from those remote forests to meditation centers all over the world. And it might just offer you a way to stop running too. But before we get to what they discovered, we need to understand what they were running from. Or rather, what they stopped running from. Because the truth is, you and I are running from the same thing. We just have better distractions. Let me tell you about a woman I once knew. I'll call her Rachel. Rachel was 38 years old when she first came to a meditation center. On paper, she had everything. A good job in marketing, a nice apartment in the city, plenty of friends, a boyfriend who loved her. But she woke up every morning with a knot in her stomach that wouldn't go away. She'd tried everything to get rid of that knot. Therapy, exercise, medication, yoga, travel, new hobbies, new relationships. The knot would loosen for a while, but it always came back. It came back on Sunday evenings when the weekend was ending. It came back at 3 a.m. when she couldn't sleep. It came back whenever she was alone with nothing to distract her. During a meditation retreat, Rachel had an experience that changed everything. She was sitting in the meditation hall, eyes closed, trying to follow her breath, when suddenly she saw it. Not with her eyes, but with something deeper. She saw that her entire life had been a running away. Every achievement, every relationship, every plan for the future, all of it was just running. Running from that knot. Running from the unease. Running from something she'd never let herself see. And what was she running from? She later described it this way. I was running from the fact that I'm going to die. That's it. That's what it all came down to. Everything I did was trying to outrun death. And I never even knew it. That's the insight the forest monks discovered a century ago. That's the insight the Buddha discovered 25 centuries ago. And that's the insight you might discover too, if you're willing to stop running. But stopping is harder than it sounds. Because the mind doesn't want to stop. The mind has been running for so long that running feels like breathing. It feels like what you are, not what you do. So how do you stop? What does stopping actually look like? The forest monks developed an answer to that question. It wasn't a comfortable answer. It wasn't an easy answer. But it was an answer that worked. They walked directly toward the very thing everyone else was running from. If this exploration of what it means to stop running speaks to something in you, I invite you to subscribe to Monk's Temple. Each week, we explore teachings and practices that challenge the comfortable lies we tell ourselves, not to make you miserable, but to help you wake up to a life that's actually worth living. Hit the subscribe button below. Consider it your first step out of the running and into the stopping. Let me take you back to Thailand in the late 19th century. The Kingdom of Siam, as it was then called, was a place of dense jungles, winding rivers, villages on stilts, and temples with roofs that curved upward like the wings of birds. Buddhism had been here for over 1,000 years, brought by missionaries, embraced by kings, woven into the fabric of daily life. But by the 1890s, something had happened to Buddhism in Thailand. It had become comfortable. It had become respectable. It had become, in many ways, the opposite of what the Buddha actually taught. Imagine walking into a temple in Bangkok during this period. You'd see monks in carefully tailored robes, sitting on cushions, chanting scriptures in the ancient Pali language. You'd smell incense burning, hear the gentle clinking of donation bowls, feel the cool stone floor beneath your feet. These monks ate well, sometimes too well. They slept in proper buildings with roofs that didn't leak. They studied scriptures, performed ceremonies for villagers who needed blessings, received donations, and enjoyed the respect of the community. It was safe. It was organized. It was comfortable. And somewhere along the way, it stopped being what the Buddha actually did. The Buddha wasn't comfortable. The Buddha was a prince who walked away from his palace, from luxury, from security, from everything he'd ever known. Because he understood something that most of us spend our lives trying not to understand. The palace was beautiful. It had everything a person could want. But it was still a cage. For 6 years after leaving that palace, the Buddha wandered through forests. He slept under trees. He ate whatever appeared in his begging bowl, which sometimes meant nothing at all. He practiced austerities so extreme that he nearly died. And he meditated in charnel grounds. Places where dead bodies were left to decay, because he understood that you cannot wake up while you're still hiding from the most basic facts of existence. By the 1890s, most Thai monks had forgotten this. They weren't wandering. They weren't sleeping under trees. They certainly weren't meditating with corpses. They were professionals, not practitioners. Religion had become a career path rather than a transformation. And then 2 monks began asking dangerous questions. Their names were Ajahn Mun and Ajahn Mun. Ajahn Mun was the elder, a quiet man who practiced in the forests of northeast Thailand without seeking students or writing books or building anything. He sometimes went months without speaking to anyone. He just practiced. Ajahn Mun was different. Younger, more driven, more willing to challenge the establishment. He'd been born in 1870 in a small village called Baon Kambon. His family farmed rice, like everyone else. He entered the monastery as a boy, learned to read and write, studied the scriptures, did what was expected. But something didn't sit right with him. He looked at the comfortable monks in their comfortable temples, and then he read the Buddha's words about wandering in forests, about sleeping at the foot of trees, about meditating in places where bodies rot. And he thought, if this is what the Buddha did, and this is what we're doing, these are not the same thing. Most people would push that thought aside. Most people would tell themselves that times have changed, that the Buddha's practices were for ancient India, not modern Thailand, that comfort is fine, that you can become enlightened in a temple as easily as in a forest. But Mun couldn't push it aside. The question wouldn't leave him alone. Around 1893, Mun stood in his monastery room at dawn. Outside, he could hear the other monks beginning their morning chanting. The familiar rhythms he'd heard thousands of times. He could smell breakfast cooking. He knew exactly what the day would bring: more chanting, more study, more ceremonies, more of the same. He picked up his begging bowl. He left his few possessions behind: a spare robe, a razor, a needle and thread. He walked to the edge of the monastery grounds. And then he kept walking. He walked into the forest. Into the jungle. Into territory that villagers warned was filled with tigers and cobras and malaria and spirits. Into complete isolation, with no guarantee of food, no shelter, no safety, no return. And he never came back. Years later, a senior monk would ask him why he'd abandoned such a promising position in the monastic hierarchy. Mun's answer was simple and devastating. I wanted to practice what we preach. Think about that for a moment. How many of us could say the same? How many of us actually practice what we preach, what we believe, what we know to be true? We know we should exercise, but we don't. We know we should eat better, but we don't. We know we should spend more time with people we love, but we don't. We know we should face the difficult things instead of avoiding them, but we don't. We preach one thing and practice another. And the gap between them is where our suffering lies. Mun closed that gap. He walked into the forest not because he was trying to be heroic, not because he wanted to prove anything, but because he couldn't live with the gap anymore. He had to know what was actually true, not just what was comfortable. What he found in those forests would challenge everything Thai Buddhism assumed about the path to awakening. And what he found might challenge everything you assume about your own life. Let me tell you about what Mun actually did in those forests, because it matters. He didn't just wander around having spiritual experiences. He followed a specific set of practices called the Dhatanga, 13 optional ascetic observances that the Buddha himself had praised but that most monks had abandoned by the 1900s. The word Dhatanga means, means of shaking off. That's exactly what these practices were designed to do. Shake off attachment, shake off comfort, shake off the illusion that you need anything to be happy. They weren't punishments. They weren't about suffering for suffering's sake. They were tools, training wheels for letting go. And like training wheels, they were meant to be used until you no longer needed them. 3 of these practices were particularly radical. The first was wearing robes made from discarded cloth. Imagine you're a forest monk. You don't accept new cloth from donors like other monks do. Instead, you walk through villages and look for what's been thrown away. You find rags. You find discarded cloth. You find funeral shrouds, the cloth that corpses were wrapped in before cremation. You take these rags to the river. You wash them. You sew them together by hand. And that becomes your robe. Now think about what this does psychologically. Every time you look at your robe, you're reminded that this cloth was once wrapped around a dead body. Every time you feel the fabric against your skin, you're touching death. What happens to pride in that context? What happens to the ego's need to feel special, to look good, be admired? It doesn't have anywhere to stand. The second practice was eating only from the alms bowl, once a day. At dawn, the forest monks would walk through villages with their bowls extended. They wouldn't ask for anything. They wouldn't choose what they received. They would accept whatever villagers offered, rice, vegetables, fruit, sometimes nothing at all. Whatever went into the bowl became their one meal for the entire day. They would eat it before noon, and then they wouldn't eat again until the next morning. No snacking. No evening tea. No, I deserve a treat. One meal. That's it. What's happening here? You're confronting the mind's constant relationship with pleasure. Most of us eat not because we're hungry but because we want the experience of eating. We want the taste, the satisfaction, the distraction. Food is one of the primary ways we soothe ourselves when we're uncomfortable. Remove that option, and suddenly you're face to face with all the discomfort you've been numbing with food. Ajahn Mun once went 7 days eating nothing but boiled rice water. Not because of famine, not because he was punishing himself, but because that's simply what appeared in his bowl each day. Rice. Water. Day after day. He said later that on the 7th day, he understood something clearly: the mind that craves tasty food and the mind that experiences deep peace cannot coexist. They're enemies. One pulls you toward the world, the other pulls you toward freedom. And you have to choose which one you're going to feed. The third practice is perhaps the most confronting: sleeping wherever night falls, with no shelter. The Buddha spent years sleeping at the foot of trees. Not in monasteries, not in buildings, not even in caves when he could avoid it. Under trees, exposed to weather, to animals, to everything that might come in the night. The forest monks revived this practice. When darkness came, they didn't look for a comfortable spot. They stopped wherever they were and sat down. Under a tree, in a cave, in an abandoned cemetery, in the middle of the jungle. No walls. No roof. No protection. Now imagine what this does to the mind. When you sleep exposed, you're vulnerable. Animals can approach. Weather can soak you. Snakes can curl up next to you for warmth. Every sound in the night is potentially dangerous. Most people would lie awake in terror. And that's exactly the point. The practice forces you to confront something that modern life has almost completely eliminated: the raw, primal awareness of your own vulnerability. You're not in control. You're not safe. You're a soft, warm, edible creature in a world full of things that could kill you. And yet, you sit there. You stay. You don't run. Ajahn Mun once woke under a tree to find a king cobra coiled about 2 feet from his head. The snake was massive, deadly, close enough that Mun could see its scales in the moonlight. His first instinct, of course, was terror. Every cell in his body screamed, "Move, run, get away." But he didn't move. He sat there, watching the snake, watching his own mind's reaction to the snake, watching fear arise and peak and begin to subside. He later said that in that moment, he understood something. If he was truly attached to this body, he would have to run. But if he wasn't attached, what was there to run from? The snake eventually left. Mun sat there until dawn. What he discovered that night wasn't courage. It was something more fundamental, the realization that fear of death isn't the problem. Running from that fear is the problem. When you stop running, fear becomes just another sensation. Intense, yes. Uncomfortable, definitely. But not something that controls you. Now we need to understand something important about these practices. They weren't random acts of self-punishment. They were carefully designed to achieve a specific psychological result. Modern neuroscience has something to teach us here. The human brain has what researchers call a default mode network, a set of brain regions that become active when you're not focused on anything in particular. This network is responsible for mind wandering, for rumination, for thinking about the past and future, for the constant narrative of me and my story. When you're comfortable, this network runs constantly. You're lost in thought, in planning, in worrying, in fantasizing. You're not really present. You're living in your head, constructing stories about who you are and what your life means. When you introduce discomfort, real physical discomfort, like hunger or cold or fear, something interesting happens. The default mode network quiets down. Your attention gets pulled into the present moment because the present moment demands it. You can't worry about tomorrow when a snake is 2 feet away. You can't ruminate about the past when you're hungry and cold and trying to stay alive. The forest monks discovered this empirically, a century before neuroscience confirmed it. They learned that comfort is actually the enemy of presence. That when you're too comfortable, you drift off into fantasy. That sometimes you need to introduce just enough discomfort to wake yourself up. This is why the Buddha himself said that enlightenment isn't found in pleasure, but it's also not found in self-torture. It's found in a middle way, but that middle way isn't comfort. It's the willingness to be with whatever arises, pleasant or unpleasant, without running. Let me tell you about a woman I'll call Patricia. Patricia was 52 years old, a retired teacher who had spent 30 years in classrooms. She'd loved her work, but retirement had left her adrift. Without the structure of teaching, without the daily contact with students and colleagues, she found herself face to face with something she'd been avoiding her entire adult life, herself. She'd fill her days with activities, yoga classes, book clubs, volunteering, coffee with friends. But underneath the busyness, there was an unease that wouldn't go away. A feeling that something was missing, that she was running out of time, that she'd never really lived. Patricia signed up for a week-long meditation retreat at a center in the hills. She'd never meditated before, but she was desperate enough to try anything. The first 3 days were torture. Her mind wouldn't stop chattering. Her body ached from sitting. She wanted to leave every hour of every day. On the 4th day, something broke. Not dramatically, no visions, no profound insights. Just a simple recognition, she'd been running her whole life. Running from the silence. Running from the emptiness. Running from the simple, terrifying fact that underneath all her roles, teacher, wife, mother, friend, there was just awareness. Nothing solid. Nothing permanent. Just this moment, then the next, then the next. She later described it this way: I realized I'd been using activity the way some people use alcohol. To numb myself. to avoid feeling the thing I most needed to feel. And what was that thing? Just being alive. Just the raw fact of existence. I'd been running from that my whole life. Here's what Patricia discovered, and what the forest monks discovered before her: the running itself is the problem. Not what you're running from. Not what you're running toward. The running. When you're running, you're never here. You're always somewhere else, in the past, in the future, in fantasy, in worry, in planning. You're never actually living your life. You're just preparing to live it, or recovering from having lived it, or wishing you were living it differently. The forest monks stopped running so completely that they walked directly toward the very thing everyone runs from, death itself. They understood that until you've faced death, you haven't really faced anything. Until you've looked at the end, you can't understand the beginning. But you don't need to meditate in a cemetery to stop running. You just need to notice, right now, in this moment, that you're doing it. Notice the subtle tension in your body. Notice the way your mind reaches for the next thought, the next distraction, the next thing to do. Notice how uncomfortable it feels to just be here, with nothing to do, nowhere to go, no one to be. That discomfort, that's the running. That's the habit. And like any habit, it can be broken. Not by force, not by effort, but by simple awareness. By noticing, over and over, that you're running. And then, just for a moment, stopping. Now we come to the practice that separated the forest monks from everyone else. The 13th Dhatanga observance, Sosanika, the charnel ground practice. In ancient India, and in parts of Thailand into the early 20th century, dead bodies weren't always buried or cremated immediately. They were often taken to specific places. Charnel grounds, cemeteries, areas outside villages, and left there. Sometimes they were cremated partially. Sometimes they were just left to decay, consumed by animals and insects and the elements. These places were terrifying. They smelled of death. They were haunted, according to local belief, by spirits and demons. People avoided them at all costs, especially at night. The forest monks walked directly into them. The Buddha himself gave explicit instructions for this practice. In the Satipatthana Sutta, one of his most famous discourses on mindfulness, he says, again, monks, as if a monk were to see a corpse thrown aside in a charnel ground, 1 day dead, 2 days dead, 3 days dead, bloated, livid, and festering, he applies it to this same body. This body too is of the same nature. It will become like that. It is not exempt from that fate. The sutta goes on to describe each stage of decay. Being devoured by animals, reduced to a skeleton with some flesh remaining, then just bones scattered, then bones bleached white, then bones crumbling to dust. At each stage, the practitioner is instructed to contemplate, this body too is of the same nature. It will become like that. It is not exempt from that fate. This wasn't theoretical. This wasn't a metaphor. This was direct, visceral, undeniable confrontation with the reality of death. Why would anyone do this? Let me answer that question with another question. Have you ever noticed how much of your life is spent trying not to think about death? We don't say it that way, of course. We say we're planning for the future. We say we're building security. We say we're taking care of our health. But underneath all of that, there's a quiet, constant terror, I'm going to die, and I don't know when, and I can't control it, and that terrifies me. This terror shapes almost everything we do. It's why we accumulate money and possessions, because maybe if we have enough, we'll feel safe. It's why we seek status and recognition, because maybe if we're important enough, we'll be exempt. It's why we stay in relationships that aren't working and jobs that drain us and lives that feel small, because at least it's familiar, at least we know what to expect, at least we're not facing the unknown. The terror of death is the engine of most human suffering. And the only way out of it is to go directly into it. This is what the forest monks understood. They didn't meditate with corpses because they were morbid or depressed or trying to be edgy. They did it because they knew that you can't loosen death's grip until you've stopped looking away from it. Let me try to describe what this experience might have been like. Imagine you're a forest monk in early 20th century Thailand. You've been walking through the jungle all day. As the sun begins to set, you approach the charnel ground on the edge of a village. You can smell it before you see it, that sweet, sickly smell of decay that you never forget once you've encountered it. You walk into the clearing. There are bodies here. Some are fresh, maybe a day or two dead. Some are older, partially decomposed, bones showing through rotting flesh. Insects crawl over them. Animals have been here, you can see where they've torn at the flesh. You choose a spot about 2 meters from one of the bodies. You sit down. You arrange your robe. You close your eyes. And you begin to meditate. The smell is overwhelming at first. Your stomach turns. Every instinct screams at you to leave, to run, to get away from this place of death. But you stay. You stay as darkness falls. You stay as the sounds of the forest change, the daytime birds falling silent, the nighttime creatures beginning to stir. You stay as your mind conjures images of spirits and demons, as every shadow becomes a threat, as the body next to you seems to move in the moonlight. You stay. And slowly, something shifts. The smell becomes just smell. The body becomes just a body. The fear becomes just a sensation in your body, tightness in your chest, quickness in your breath, nothing more. You're still scared, but you're no longer running from the fear. You're just sitting with it. Hours pass. The moon crosses the sky. At some point, you hear movement in the darkness, something large, circling. You open your eyes and see the gleam of eyes in the moonlight. A tiger, maybe 30 meters away. It watches you. You watch it. Minutes pass. You think, I'm going to die anyway. Whether tonight or in 50 years, this body will end up like that one. So why run? The tiger eventually leaves. You sit until dawn. When villagers find you in the morning, still sitting there next to the corpse, they're amazed. Some think you're crazy. Some think you're holy. But you know something they don't, you've looked at death directly, and you're still here. And in some fundamental way, you're no longer afraid. There's a modern parallel to this practice that might help you understand what the forest monks discovered. Hospice workers, people who sit with dying patients every day, often describe a paradoxical effect. Being around death constantly doesn't depress them. It makes them more alive. I once spoke with a hospice nurse named Diane who had worked with dying patients for over 20 years. She told me something I've never forgotten. She said, when you watch someone take their last breath, you realize how much you've been taking your own breaths for granted. Every breath becomes precious. Every moment becomes significant. You stop putting things off because you understand, really understand, that there may not be a later. Diane described how her work had changed her. She no longer worried about the small things that used to consume her. She no longer postponed difficult conversations or put off telling people she loved them. She no longer lived in the future, always planning for some tomorrow that might never come. I'm not afraid of death anymore, she told me. I don't want to die, I love my life. But I'm not afraid. I've sat with too many people in their final moments to be afraid. What I've learned is that death isn't the enemy. The enemy is not living. The enemy is waiting until it's too late to actually be here. The forest monks discovered this same truth a century ago. Confronting death doesn't create nihilism. It creates urgency. It creates presence. It creates the ability to distinguish between what matters and what doesn't. When you know you're going to die. Not intellectually, not theoretically, but in your bones, you stop wasting time on things that don't matter. You stop postponing your real life. You start living. Let me tell you about a man named Harold. Harold was 73 years old when he came to a meditation center. He'd been diagnosed with terminal cancer and given maybe 6 months to live. He didn't come because he believed meditation would cure him. He came because he didn't know what else to do with the terror. The first few days, he couldn't sit still. He paced. He talked constantly to anyone who would listen. He couldn't bear to be alone with his thoughts. The meditation center had a beautiful view of the mountains, but Harold couldn't see it. He was too busy running inside his own mind. On the 4th day, a teacher took him aside and said something that changed everything. The teacher said, "Harold, you're running. You've been running your whole life, and now you're running from death. But death is faster than you. It always wins the race. So why not stop running? Why not just sit down and see what happens?" Harold sat down. He didn't try to meditate. He didn't try to do anything special. He just sat in a chair by the window and watched the light change over the hills. He sat there for 3 hours. When he finally stood up, something had shifted. The terror was still there, but it had become manageable. It was just a feeling now, not a command. He could breathe around it. He could be with it. It was like discovering that the monster under his bed was just shadows and dust. For the next 5 months, he lived longer than the doctors predicted. Harold came to that meditation center every day. He didn't become enlightened. He didn't have profound mystical experiences. But something happened that was perhaps more important than any spiritual experience. He stopped running. He started living his remaining days instead of just enduring them. His daughter later told me, "The last months with my father were the best months of my entire life with him. He was finally present. Finally here. It took dying for him to learn how to live." Now let me tell you another story, this one about a woman named Francine who was very much alive and healthy but living as if she were already dead. Francine was 41, a corporate lawyer in a large firm, successful by every external measure. She had the corner office, the 6-figure salary, the apartment with the view, the wardrobe, the car, the vacations. She also had a persistent feeling that none of it mattered. She came to a meditation retreat because her therapist suggested it. She came skeptical, armed with arguments about why this was a waste of her valuable time. She came prepared to be unimpressed. On the third day, during a walking meditation period, she stopped in the middle of the path and started laughing. Not happy laughter, something closer to hysterical laughter, the kind that comes from recognizing an absurd truth. A teacher approached and asked what was happening. Francine said, "I just realized that I've been running from death my entire life by building a life that looks impressive on paper. I thought if I was successful enough, important enough, rich enough, I'd be safe. I'd be exempt. And it's all been a joke. A massive, expensive, time-consuming joke. Death doesn't care about my corner office." The teacher said, "So what now?" Francine thought for a long moment. Then she said, "I guess I stop running. I guess I actually live." She didn't quit her job that day. She didn't sell her apartment or give away her wardrobe. But something shifted. She started making choices based on what actually mattered to her, not on what would look good on paper. She started having conversations she'd been avoiding for years. She started being present with the people she loved instead of always thinking about the next deal, the next case, the next achievement. 3 years later, she left corporate law entirely and started a small practice doing legal work for nonprofits. She made a fraction of what she'd made before. She was happier than she'd ever been. Here's what the forest monks understood, and what Harold discovered, and what Francine discovered, and what you might discover too: death is not the problem. Running from death is the problem. When you stop running, something remarkable happens. You discover that you can be with anything. You can be with fear. You can be with grief. You can be with uncertainty. You can be with the most difficult experiences imaginable, and they don't destroy you. They're just experiences. They arise, they peak, they pass away. You are the space in which they happen, not the experiences themselves. This is the freedom the forest monks found in those charnel grounds. Not freedom from death, death still comes for everyone. But freedom from the fear of death. Freedom from the constant running. Freedom to actually live. And here's the most important part: you don't need to wait until you're dying to discover this. You don't need to meditate with corpses. You just need to stop running from whatever you're running from right now. What is it? What's the one thing you've been avoiding? The conversation you need to have? The feeling you've been numbing? The truth about your life you've been pretending isn't true? The silence you fill with noise? The emptiness you cover with activity? That's your charnel ground. That's where your practice needs to go. Not because you're supposed to suffer, but because on the other side of that avoidance is freedom. On the other side of that fear is peace. On the other side of that running is the life you've been waiting to live. Now we need to talk about something that might make you uncomfortable. The forest monks didn't just report experiences of peace and presence. They reported experiences that, from a modern Western perspective, sound impossible. Ajahn Mun, the central figure of this tradition, claimed to teach Dhamma to devas, gods or celestial beings. He described detailed visions of other realms, heavens, hells, the hungry ghost realm. He said he could perceive beings invisible to ordinary sight. He claimed knowledge of past lives, his own and others. What do we do with these claims? If you're a traditional Thai Buddhist, you accept them literally. The Pali Canon, the earliest Buddhist scriptures, describes these abilities as natural results of deep meditative practice. The Buddha himself is said to have had them. So when Mun reports them, it's not surprising, it's confirmation that his practice was genuine. If you're a Western skeptic, you dismiss them as hallucinations, cultural conditioning, or perhaps deliberate fabrications. The mind under extreme conditions can produce all kinds of experiences. That doesn't make them real. But there's a third option, and it's the one I want to explore with you. Instead of asking, are these claims literally true, ask a different question. What was Mun experiencing? First, understand the context. Thailand in the early 1900s wasn't secular. It wasn't even religious in the way we think of religion in the West. The spiritual world was simply part of the world. Every village had spirit houses, small shrines where offerings were made to the local spirits. Every home had protective amulets. Every forest was inhabited by beings, some benevolent, some dangerous, all real to the people who lived there. When villagers talked about Phi, ghosts, or Deva, gods, or Naga, serpent beings, they weren't speaking metaphorically. These beings were as real as tigers and elephants. You didn't have to believe in them, you just knew they existed. So when Mun walked into the forest, he walked into a world already populated, in the minds of everyone around him, by invisible beings. And when his meditation practice deepened, when his mind became extraordinarily concentrated and sensitive, it's not surprising that he began to perceive these beings. Here's what's interesting from a modern perspective. Research on deep meditation, particularly in traditions that emphasize concentration and absorption states, jhana in the Buddhist tradition, shows that the mind becomes capable of experiences that are qualitatively different from ordinary perception. Sensory experience can fade away completely. The sense of self can dissolve. Time can seem to stop. And vivid, detailed imagery can arise that feels utterly real. Neuroscience doesn't have a complete explanation for these phenomena, but it's clear that the brain under these conditions is capable of extraordinary things. Now add to this the power of cultural expectation. Mun grew up in a world where gods and spirits were simply part of reality. His mind was primed, from childhood, to interpret certain kinds of experiences as encounters with these beings. When deep meditation produced vivid, seemingly external experiences, what framework would he use to understand them? The framework he'd always had. This doesn't mean the experiences weren't real. It means the question of reality is more complicated than we usually assume. Maybe we can hold these claims in a different way. Maybe Mun actually perceived something. Maybe his mind, pushed to extraordinary levels of concentration and sensitivity, became capable of perceiving dimensions of reality that are normally invisible to us. The history of human experience across cultures suggests that this is possible, that under certain conditions, people have experiences that transcend ordinary perception. Or maybe these were purely internal experiences, products of his own mind, but that doesn't make them less valuable. The mind is capable of generating experiences of profound beauty and meaning. A vision of a deva could be a powerful teaching, regardless of whether there's an actual being out there. Or maybe the distinction between internal and external isn't as clear as we think. Maybe when the mind becomes deeply concentrated, the usual boundaries soften, and we have access to dimensions of experience that our normal categories can't capture. What matters, for our purposes, isn't whether you believe in gods and spirits. What matters is that Mun's experiences point to something important. The mind, when pushed to its limits, reveals capacities we normally don't access. You don't have to believe in past lives to find value in the question. What would it mean to live as if this life wasn't the only one? You don't have to believe in gods to find value in the question. What would it mean to feel connected to something larger than yourself? Let me tell you about a man named Gregory who struggled with this very question. Gregory was a physicist, a man of science who believed in what could be measured, tested, and proven. He came to meditation not because he believed in anything spiritual but because his wife had dragged him to a class and he found it helpful for stress. For years, he meditated in a completely secular way. It was mental training, nothing more. Then something happened that he still can't explain. During a meditation retreat, in the middle of a perfectly ordinary sitting, Gregory had an experience that shattered his categories. The room dissolved. His sense of being a separate self dissolved. There was just awareness. Infinite, aware, peaceful. And within that awareness, he felt connected to everything, to the other meditators, to the trees outside, to the stars, to all of existence. It wasn't a thought. It was a direct, undeniable experience. When he came out of it, Gregory was changed. Not because he now believed in something supernatural, but because he now knew, directly, that reality was larger than his previous understanding of it. He struggled with this for months. His scientific mind wanted to dismiss it as a brain glitch, a temporary malfunction. But the experience had been too real, too profound, too transformative to simply wave away. Eventually, Gregory came to a kind of peace with the mystery. He still valued science, still believed in evidence, but he no longer believed that the measurable world was the only world. He'd touched something beyond measurement, and that touch had changed him. He once said, "Before that experience, I thought I knew what reality was. After it, I realized I'd been looking through a keyhole and thinking I'd seen the whole room." Now we need to bring this back to the forest monks and what they actually discovered. For decades, the forest monks were a small, marginal movement in Thailand. Mainstream Buddhism considered them extreme, possibly misguided. Some criticized them as misrepresenting Buddhism as morbid and grim. Others worried that their supernatural claims made Buddhism look like folk religion. But the forest monks had one advantage that no amount of criticism could overcome: their practice produced visible results. Villagers could see the difference between a monk who'd spent 20 years meditating in forests and a monk who'd spent 20 years chanting in a comfortable temple. The forest monk walked differently, spoke differently, carried himself differently. There was a stillness about him, a fearlessness, an equanimity that couldn't be faked. Word spread. People began seeking these monks out. Villagers would bring food to the forest edges, leaving it for monks who rarely came into town. Parents would bring their sons to be ordained by these wandering ascetics. Even city monks, the comfortable temple dwellers, began to take notice. By the mid-20th century, the forest tradition had become one of the most influential movements in Thai Buddhism. Ajahn Mun, who'd started with nothing but a begging bowl and a willingness to face death, had thousands of followers. When he died in 1949, tens of thousands attended his funeral, villagers, monks, even members of the royal family. But something unexpected was about to happen. The tradition was about to go global. In the 1960s and 70s, a wave of young Westerners began arriving in Thailand. They were seekers, dropouts from the materialistic society they'd grown up in. They'd tried drugs, they'd tried free love, they'd tried dropping out. Now some of them were looking for something deeper. Most went to India for yoga and Hindu teachings. Some went to Japan for Zen. Thailand was less famous, the forest tradition almost unknown in the West. But a few found their way there. Jack Cornfield was a 23-year-old American when he walked into Wat Pa Pong in 1967. He'd been in the Peace Corps, had studied Asian cultures, thought he knew what to expect. But when he met the monks at Wat Pa Pong, he realized he'd been wrong. These weren't scholars who'd studied Buddhism. They were practitioners who'd lived it. They'd meditated for decades in forests. They'd faced tigers and snakes and corpses and their own terrified minds. And their presence. You could feel something different, something that couldn't be faked. Cornfield later described walking into the monastery and seeing a monk sitting under a tree. The monk wasn't doing anything special. He was just sitting. But something about the way he sat, the quality of stillness around him, stopped Cornfield in his tracks. He later said, "I knew in that moment that I'd found what I'd been looking for. I didn't know what it was yet. But I knew it was real." And so we arrive at the question that matters most for you, sitting here, listening to these words, living your one precious life. The Thai forest tradition began over a century ago with a monk who walked into a jungle because he couldn't bear the gap between what he preached and how he lived. It continued through decades of practice in caves and cemeteries, through encounters with tigers and cobras and gods and demons, through the transformation of thousands of human beings who dared to stop running. And now it arrives here, in this moment, with you. What does any of this have to do with your life? You're probably not going to shave your head and move to a Thai forest monastery. You're probably not going to meditate with corpses or sleep under trees. You have a job, a family, a life that doesn't include wandering through jungles or facing down tigers. But here's what the forest monks would say to you: the practice isn't about the external forms. It's about what the forms point to. You don't need a corpse to confront death. You don't need a forest to face what terrifies you. You need willingness. You need honesty. You need the courage to stop running. Your charnel ground will look different from Ajahn Mun's. It might be sitting alone in your apartment on a Saturday night instead of distracting yourself with social plans. It might be having the conversation you've been avoiding for years. It might be looking at your bank account honestly, without denial or fantasy. It might be sitting with the grief you've never fully felt. It might be staying present with the anxiety in your body instead of reaching for your phone, your glass, your remote, your endless distractions. It might be lying in bed at night, unable to sleep, and instead of fighting it or worrying about tomorrow, just being with the darkness, the quiet, the strange aliveness of 3 in the morning. Whatever it is, that's your practice. That's where the path begins. Let me tell you one last story. This one is about a woman named Helen who discovered her own charnel ground in the most ordinary of places. Helen was 68, retired, living alone after her husband of 40 years had passed away 2 years earlier. She'd done everything right, according to the grief books. She'd gone to therapy. She'd joined a support group. She'd stayed busy with friends and activities. She'd done all the things you're supposed to do. But the grief was still there, a weight on her chest that never lifted. One night, unable to sleep, Helen did something she'd never done before. Instead of getting up to read or watch television or make tea, she just lay there in the darkness. She didn't try to change anything. She didn't try to feel better. She just let the grief be there. And for the first time in 2 years, something shifted. Not the grief, that was still there, but her relationship to it. She later described it as stopping fighting. All that time, she'd been fighting her grief, trying to overcome it, trying to get past it, trying to be the person she was before. And in that fighting, she'd been running. Running from the very thing that needed to be felt. Lying there in the darkness, Helen stopped running. She let the grief wash through her. She let herself miss her husband, really miss him, without trying to make it better. She let herself be sad, be lost, be broken. She let herself be exactly what she was. And somewhere in that letting, something healed. Not the wound would always be there. But the infection around the wound, the resistance, the fighting, that began to dissolve. Helen later said, "I spent 2 years trying to get over my grief. And then I discovered that the only way out was through. I had to go into it, not away from it. I had to sit in my own charnel ground." This is the invitation of the forest tradition. Not to become someone else. Not to achieve some special state. Not to escape the human condition. But to stop running long enough to discover that you can be with whatever is here. The Buddha didn't become enlightened by escaping life. He became enlightened by facing it completely, without flinching, without running. He sat under that tree and made a promise, "I will not move until I understand. Not until I'm comfortable. Not until I'm safe. Not until I get what I want. Until I understand." The forest monks took that promise seriously. They sat in charnel grounds and made the same vow, "I will not run. I will not move. I will stay here with this fear, this disgust, this terror, until I understand what it's made of." And what they discovered was that fear, when faced, loses its power. That death, when looked at directly, becomes just another truth. That running, when stopped, reveals a peace that was always there, waiting. So here's your practice for today, for tonight, for the rest of your life. Stop running. Just for a moment. Just for a breath. Stop. Feel what's here. The weight of your body. The movement of your breath. The thoughts moving through your mind. The emotions in your heart. Whatever is here, let it be here. Don't try to change it. Don't try to fix it. Don't try to make it go away. Just let it be. This is the whole path. This is what the forest monks discovered in those charnel grounds. This is what the Buddha discovered under the Bodhi tree. This is what every practitioner throughout history has discovered. You can stop running. You can be with whatever is here. And in that being with, you can find a peace that isn't dependent on conditions. A peace that isn't threatened by change. A peace that death itself cannot touch. The Thai forest tradition began with a monk who walked into a jungle because he couldn't live with the gap between his words and his life. It continued through generations of practitioners who faced everything human beings are capable of facing. And now it passes to you. Not as a doctrine to believe. Not as a set of rituals to perform. But as an invitation. An invitation to stop running. An invitation to sit down in whatever charnel ground you've been avoiding. An invitation to discover, for yourself, what lies on the other side of fear. What lies there is not what you expect. It's not numbness. It's not depression. It's not resignation. It's life. Real life. Unfiltered, unmediated, fully experienced life. The life you've been running from is the only life there is. And it's been waiting for you all along. If this exploration has touched something in you, I invite you to subscribe to Monk's Temple. Each week, we explore teachings and practices that challenge the comfortable lies we tell ourselves, not to make you miserable, but to help you wake up to a life that's actually worth living. We'll continue exploring the forest tradition in future videos, the teachers who carried it forward, the Westerners who brought it home, the practices that continue to transform lives. But for now, consider this your practice. Whatever your charnel ground is, go there. Gently. With kindness toward yourself. But go there. And stay long enough to discover that you can. Because in the end, that's where reality begins. That's where freedom begins. That's where you begin. Thank you for listening. Thank you for practicing. Thank you for being willing to stop running. May you find the courage to face whatever arises. May you discover the peace that comes from stopping. May you live your life fully, awake to each moment, until your last breath. Welcome to Monk's Temple. The path is here. The practice is now. The freedom is possible.